Let's dive in. I'm really excited to welcome our guest speaker, Dan Porter. He is the Associate Director in the Climate Program of the Forest Strategy Lead. Let's see if I said those words in the correct order, Dan. At the Nature Conservancy. And I'm really grateful to Susie Petrie, who's here, who connected me to Dan. So thank you so much to you, Susie. Dan leads the development and implementation of TNC's forest and wildfire strategies across the great state of California. And he's going to talk to us about some examples of partnerships and some of the key success factors to those partnerships. What makes a partnership successful, and what can we all learn from some of the things that he's done. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dan.
Thank you, Annie. It's great to be here. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, good. Well, as Annie said, I'm Dan Porter. I'm with the Nature Conservancy's California chapter. I've been with TNC for about 16 years, working on a variety of forest and wildfire issues. And it's great to see some familiar faces here from some of that past work. I have just a couple examples of partnership work that we've engaged in over the last few years that I would say is on the more complicated, maybe somewhat innovative side of things, just to prompt discussion. This is clearly a very experienced group, so I'm going to try to keep my presentation pretty concise so that then maybe we can get into the nitty-gritty of partnerships and what you all think is required to make them sing. I've got my own opinions, but I think everyone would agree that partnerships are so varied and nuanced that there's a zillion different ways you can approach them. So with that intro, I will just share a couple slides with you. Okay. Okay. Can someone give me a thumbs up if they can see this?
Thumbs up.
Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you so much. For those of you who haven't tracked TNC's work specifically, over the last about 10 years, we have been very, very focused on scaling forest treatments with partners. And so much so that we've come to the conclusion that partnerships are really essential, maybe even mandatory in order to get to scale in terms of forest restoration treatments. And by forest restoration treatments, I'm referring to the full suite of tools that I think we know about, right? Prescribed fire, managed wildfire for resource benefit, cultural fire, and ecological thinning. And we've learned a lot over those 10 years. I'll go through just a couple sample projects to highlight how we've approached those partnerships, how we've managed ourselves and other interests through them, and maybe some lessons learned along the way. And then, like I said, lots of time for Q&A. And by the way, if you have a burning question during the presentation, feel free to raise your hand or just jump in. We should keep this, informal and conversational. But just by way of background, I love sharing this photo. This is a photo of the Illilouette Creek Basin in Yosemite National Park. And some of you may already know that this part of Yosemite National Park, which is in the backcountry, has been managed almost exclusively with natural and prescribed fire since about 1972. And it's one of the few places in California that fits that definition. And what's really important about that, as I'm sure many of you know, is that it's created and maintained, maintain is more accurate, what forest ecologists refer to as the forest mosaic, basically a tapestry of dense forest conditions here and here, less dense conditions created by fire, low to moderate severity fire here and here, and then of course the maintenance of large meadows over time. And you can see those dotted through here. And the really fascinating thing about frequent fire forests and the forest mosaic, which again, this is a pretty informed audience, just by way of review, is that they've worked in tandem with each other for millennia to create basically a self-sustaining system that has been fairly stable up until the 1850s or so, and just produced phenomenal diversity. So why am I sharing all this with you? This picture and everything that it represents is really kind of the North Star of the Nature Conservancy's dry forest and fire work. We are a biodiversity focused organization. We have been since our inception. We are today, and we work on identifying the biggest environmental challenges facing our world today, and then trying to develop really pragmatic
No,
solutions
I'm just listening to the.
to those big problems. So that's just by way of sort of introduction. Um, Now, most of you will know this history, but again, just to sort of set the stage, back in 2015, it was prior to some of the really big mega fires, but we were working with the Forest Service already, which, as you see here, manages about 22 million acres in California, and we're very aware of the condition of the forest there, which is to say, not good. We were aware of that in part because we had these small nature preserves embedded within a sea of wildfire-prone forest, and we were actually treating in our own preserves, like the Independence Lake Preserve outside of Truckee, because we were so worried about the condition of the surrounding forest. And so at that time, we developed basically what we now refer to as our ecologically based management toolkit, which is, a proactive, affirmative advocacy. At the time, it seemed, like we were out in front. Now it's just kind of mainstream of, actively managing forests to restore their natural structure and function. And then we got into several other projects with the Forest Service where that same toolkit and those same techniques were absolutely critical. So this is the last bit of context just to give you a sense of how these projects that I'm going to go over fit in. After developing the science and developing some publications around that and some strategic communications around our ecological approach to forest management, we got into the French Meadows project in about 2015, 2016. And we got into that project basically because we had a 10,000 acre acquisition that we were assisting on. And we wanted to transfer a good portion of that property to the Forest Service. And of course, as you do, you have to get public input and support for such a large transfer of public land. And when we approached all the partners and the neighbors in the area, we were surprised to learn that the Placer County Water Agency raised their hand and said, "We do not support the transfer of this land to the Forest Service." And that really raised some eyebrows. We never had encountered that before. And the reason was they had been impacted by the King Fire just a couple of years before, and the King Fire had created massive sedimentation problems for their reservoirs, and they were concerned that if this property was transferred to the Forest Service without the necessary forest treatments, that the same thing would befall the French Meadows reservoir, which is a key domestic water supply. So, short story, bottom line there is we developed a large project, 28,000 acres, and partnered directly with the water agency as a strong technical ally to push forward the NEPA process, the analytical process, and the permitting as quickly as possible. We actually got the NEPA done in 18 months, which I think may still be a record, I'm not sure. And we have been implementing out there since 2017. So it's been a really fruitful partnership. Where the data fits in to this story, as just a short anecdote, is that nobody at the time was using fire modeling to show the importance of doing this proactive work. And so our fire ecologists at the time did some very basic modeling, I think, with Joe Scott, and said, what would the flame length fire behavior look like with no treatment, and then with treatment. And through that process, we learned even if we treated it a little too lightly, the fire behavior would still be fairly severe because the conditions were so bad. So we actually tweaked our treatment regime to get those beneficial effects cranked up. That work led to a 10x increase in a similar project, this time with the Yuba Water Agency and with Blue Forest Conservation, Sierra County, Campbellville Community Partners, 9 partners altogether with the U.S. Forest Service again, and created basically and I'm going to go into this in a bit, a very detailed analytical process to have folks weigh in on what data they felt was most important to drive the treatment priorities. And then shortly after that, our science team created what some of you may have seen called the TCSI Pillars of Resilience, and I'll go through that a little bit as well. So this is the kind of the short history of our scale planning with data. Any questions so far on that? My time. No? Okay. So I just want to introduce you to the landscape where we do most of our work. We refer to this area, which isn't perfectly drawn on watershed boundaries. I'm sure someone's already noticed that, but it's a bit of a, a compilation of watershed boundaries and political boundaries. But we call this the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative area, and it's that 2.4 million acre area that I mentioned earlier with the Yuba River in it, the American, the Bear. And what's really interesting about this landscape, besides it having Lake Tahoe in the middle of it, is that, and not shown on this map, it's rich in partners. So we've got the South Fork American partnership down here, the SOFAR, the French Meadows project that I mentioned is right here. The whole North Yuba is covered by that North Yuba project that I mentioned here. And then, of course, we've got Lake Tahoe West right here on the west side of Lake Tahoe. And then there are several other smaller collaboratives and partnerships. So we defined this landscape probably back in, I want to say 2018 or so, with the Sierra Nevada Conservancy and the California Tahoe Conservancy, because we had been amassing so much data and so much information on the treatments that needed to be done that we felt that the information to treat this big important area was sufficient. What we really needed was to address some of the more systemic barriers slowing down the pace of restoration, like funding, lack of wood processing infrastructure, et cetera. So those 3 organizations plus Cal Forests plus the U.S. Forest Service got together and formed TCSI, and we started developing what is now referred to as the Pillars of Resilience. And the interesting thing about the Pillars of Resilience that we, today, even then, many of us threw around the word resilience quite freely. And there was not until maybe, 7, 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, a very widely distributed definition of what resilience was in the forest and wildfire context. So my colleague, Kristen Wilson, worked with Pacific Northwest Research Station, Pat Manley, and started defining for this big 2.4 million acre landscape, what might resilience mean? What does it actually mean? And they came up with this definition at the top: the capacity of systems to cope with and adapt to stress and disturbance while retaining their essential functions. And importantly, they wanted to really incorporate both the ecological and the social outcomes of management, just recognizing the importance of social outcomes in wildfire affected, impacted systems. And so in the spirit of that, they developed these pillars that are labeled around the outside here. And I think there's 9 or 10 of them altogether. And then went about systematically creating data for every single pillar, for every single small hexagon in that 2.4 million acre, and then populating that data and then aggregating that data so that there would be an aggregate score for example, fire dynamics or carbon sequestration or water security. And so for every small polygon, hexagon across this huge area, there was individual scores and scores that could be combined, mixed and matched in ways that made sense to the particular partnership. That whole data framework was the basis for the North Yuba forest partnership that I mentioned earlier, that 275,000 acre landscape. So in that partnership, the way the data was used was all the partners, the 9 partners, sat down and did a manual ranking of which of these pillars they thought was most important to the community, to the agency, to the future of the ecological integrity of this area, and basically came up with a tailored aggregate index of variables and scores that were then rolled up into a whole variety of products that I don't have time to share with you, but I'll share the most important one with you, which is this uh, aggregate layer called the restoration return on investment layer. And what this is, and all of you on this phone call can appreciate how much work this took, was basically putting all that data together, putting the people's feedback into action, running the whole thing through a climate model to understand really well what current forest conditions are and what future forest conditions will be, and then identifying each area in one of 4 management strategies: adapt, monitor, transform, and protect. So based on those scores and the climate suitability over time, we came up with these strategies to basically say, if it's a transform area, say like on the lower foothill woodlands where it's very hot and dry, maybe you don't invest there. Maybe that's an area of low investment because its transformation or conversion to a different habitat type is almost certain. In contrast, if it's a protect zone, that means that it's stable today and is predicted to be stable into the future. If it's monitor, it's in good condition now, might be later, watch it, don't do much. And adapt is in good condition now, high value, could be in bad condition later. So go ahead and think about adapting that area. So all told, all that data was amassed into this one map as basically a blueprint for where treatment investments might do the best good for the priorities that we defined. So that was a lot. Let me see if there's any questions there. I'll just pause real quick. No? Okay. All right.
I actually, Dan, I would just wanted to see in your like pillars of resilience, there's obviously likely conflicts. If you think about, excuse excuse me, if you look at wetland integration or integrity and water security, there might be some conflict there. So you try to think about how those different pillars might be adjusted or how they would have those maybe logical conflict points in the whole strategy?
Yeah, for sure. It's a great question, Kim. Usually something, well, for that particular example, and there are others that are not quite as straightforward to address,
Mhm.
there's a big distinction in scale, right? Water security is a big scale issue, and wetlands are at such a small scale. So in that case, the user group can very easily choose to develop the variables and the scores for the big things, and then lock in high priority conservation actions for the small scale things. Yeah. Yeah, good question though. Any others? No? Okay. So the wonderful thing about this whole process that I have to just mention, because it wasn't my accomplishment, it was Kristen Wilson, my colleague's accomplishment, and Pat Manley's accomplishment, is that this whole framework that I described to you, which they can, by the way, describe much better, um, was taken up eventually by the state of California as part of the Forest Resilience Task Force. And the state retained Google to develop what is now Planscape, which is the statewide version of this tool, which is guiding the investments for forest treatments across California. So a really nice example of just scaling outcomes in a relatively short period of time with a pretty leveraged investment here in one place. What I can speak more authoritatively on in terms of the partnership is that this was both a very productive partnership and a challenging partnership. And I'll give you elements of both. The productive piece was that the partners I mentioned, Sierra Nevada Conservancy, California Tahoe Conservancy, and the Nature Conservancy, were absolutely wedded to science-based decision making. And so we were all on the exact same page that this blueprint had to stand the test of rigorous scrutiny. And so to that end, we made all the data open source. All the methods were transparent. We offered trainings to anyone who was interested in getting under the hood and understanding how the variables were put together, because as you all know, there's always someone who's skeptical, or at least, questioning, has good questions about how you come up with an optimized answer. And so that was a real strength. We were so aligned on that. The Forest Service leadership at the time was also aligned on that. So that was a real strength. And the second piece of what I think makes good partnerships good, that flows from that, is shared accountability. So we had standing meetings as the data products were being developed, where the scientists were able to display where they were with respect to the analysis, give a sneak peek at some of the results, some of the weightings, so on and so forth, in and among all the forest managers and the NGO partners, who could then ask any number of questions or make recommendations for improvements. And that was a very open and safe space. It was defined from the start as collaborative, professional, always take a constructive tact at improving things. And that's how we conducted ourselves. So that was really helpful. More than helpful. I mean, I think it really unearthed some places where maybe the analysis might have gone a little too deep, and what we really needed was a product that was comprehensible by a broad range of people that we could explain fairly easily. So that was all great. We kept ourselves accountable to that. Another big piece of it, which I can share with you towards the end of the presentation, is good storytelling. So we, as the products were being produced, we created a full website, which I'll drop the link in the chat, that brings the user through the methods, the applications, and then ultimately what the implications are of using this tool. So I think that really high quality storytelling is a huge part of partnership, and it actually helps create or reinforce like a lot of the pride in the partnerships that you feel when you're in partnership in the conference room that nobody else sees. You can bring that forward and make it really obvious. Now, the flip side of the coin is this this whole process took much longer than anyone expected, and the deadlines slipped, and then they slipped again, and then they slipped again. Meanwhile, wildfires are popping off every year. They're getting more and more severe. The state and federal governments are gearing up and pretty laser focused on this region as an area of leadership for what needs to happen in the wildfire crisis. And so we had to have some heart to hearts with the team about what let's not have the perfect be the enemy of the good, but also let's keep the integrity and the rigor of the analysis going. And so that was a challenging but just kind of necessary part of doing work in the midst of a crisis. And I'm sure you all have felt that in the past in the work that you do. So yeah, just some quick reflections on that project. Any other questions before I move to the next one?
Just a quick time check. Wrap up in about 5 minutes.
Oh yeah, sure, no problem. Okay, so this example is totally different than the TCSI example. It's a more recent project, and it's a really fun example of how different kinds of data can be brought to bear on a really big conservation problem. So the picture on the left is the Tahoe Donner Community Association, or excuse me, Homeowners Association, just west of Truckee. And you don't have to squint too much to see that there are a bunch of houses embedded in a pretty dense fire-prone forest, highly exposed, highly threatened. In fact, there was a wildfire back in the 1980s that was sparked right off of Interstate 80, which if you were just south of this photo, you'd see Interstate 80, and blew up through this area back in the 80s. So the residents here and the land managers in this area were keenly aware that wildfire threatened both their homes and their recreational lands. So we had taken an interest in wildfire insurance because we, as many folks have, wondered, is there a way to basically right size the risk profiles that the insurance companies use to account for ecologically based forest management and the associated risk reduction, because the status quo is the models do not account for those actions. There's no reward for landowners who take that upon themselves to do that work, and yet it's very expensive. So, if you're a landowner and you've got a lot of land, a lot of houses, you might be able to do a bit, but you might not be incentivized to do a lot of the work. And we know that we have to do this work at scale for it to be effective. So, so we started off, as we often do, by studying the issue. So this paper from 2021 was a collaborative project between the Nature Conservancy and Willis Towers Watson, which is an insurance advisor. And we also worked with Dave Jones, former California Insurance Commissioner, who's now at UC Berkeley. And the basic goal of this paper, which I can drop the link in the chat, was to model for the French Meadows project that I mentioned earlier, um, a, a big landscape with treatments and without treatments. And in the first case with treatments, really quantify the wildfire behavior and associated damages on structures and property. And by comparing the two scenarios, this paper calculates essentially avoided cost of wildfire damage in the treated scenario. Um, and so we effectively quantified the risk reduction of ecological forestry, and said that if this set of practices were to be applied at scale across multiple communities and areas of critical infrastructure, the cost savings would be significant enough to actually potentially roll back into maintaining those treatments over time, which, as we know, is a really important piece of it. So essentially, if this modeling report was correct, then we were looking at a potential virtuous cycle that you could embed into the insurance sector. And so um, we were pretty excited about that, but a model paper is just a model paper. And so we had to go out in the field and see if it could actually work. So that's what we did next. So I'm giving you the very encapsulated version. It took actually about a year and a half of interviewing probably almost 100 different landowners, uh, ski operators, HOAs, timber companies, to basically show them the report and say, we TNC we want to test this with someone, with a buyer, and with our insurance partner. And by testing it, what we mean is we want to create the product with Willis Towers Watson, the insurance product that accounts for these variables and would be cheaper than a typical insurance product. And we want you, timber company, or you, ski resort operator, to buy the product. And in exchange, we'll pay the first year's premium for you. It sounds like a pretty good deal. But once you get into all the details, there's all kinds of legal and liability and financial reasons why folks are not ready to do this quite yet, or weren't anyway, as of a year ago. But towards the end of the project, we got really lucky and we found Tahoe Donner Association, which had been doing forest and wildfire management for 10 years. They have their own fire department. They basically have thinned all the area, the recreational land on the southeast side of their community. And they got it immediately. They just said, yep, this absolutely makes sense. We are willing to sign up. So we wrote the insurance product with Willis Towers Watson. We found an underwriter in Globe Insurance. And then Liberty was ultimately the insurer who wrote this policy for the recreational lands, not the structures, as kind of an early first step. So anything in dark purple and purple are the recreational lands adjacent to Tahoe Donner, still part of Tahoe Donner, that if a wildfire blows through, will likely not be as impacted as if had they not done the treatments, but any damages that could be repaired could be compensated for through the insurance policy itself. So real big win for the homeowners there. And so you can see some of the statistics here in terms of the premium and the lower deductible. So I think the big lessons learned from this particular project was just finding alignment among partners, which is fairly standard, but was fairly hard in this case when you're trying to find a first mover to do something that's new. And I think the other piece of it was keeping actually the data analysis and the data requirements as simple as possible, because insurers are less likely to replicate something that takes like a ton of analytical work ahead of each writing each policy. They need something fairly simple. So we worked to bridge the complexity of the fire modeling with some basic common sense judgment calls to write the policy. And in doing so, we hit that sweet spot between good data that substantiates and is credible and is not something that has to be built, from the ground up for every single policy. So anyway, a couple lessons learned from that example. And those are the examples I have. A couple others if folks are interested, but we could go to Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan, for telling those stories and sharing pictures of the land and of maps and of data. Let's open it up to questions. You can ask a question in the chat, or you can raise your real hand or your Zoom hand and come off mute, come on camera. What questions do you have?
I think I really appreciate the opportunity for you guys to go into the private sector with the insurance. That's such a huge dilemma for a lot of landowners here in Sonoma County, is that how do we afford insurance for these areas that are so at risk for fire? So to have a model that actually incorporates the insurance companies as well as homeowners associations, that just seemed like a really interesting partnership. And I'm glad that you guys were able to at least get it on the ground.
Thanks again. Yeah. It's a lot of tough sledding, a lot of shoe leather, as my partner likes to say. Yeah. Yeah. Stu, it's good to see
Yes.
your name.
Good to see you. I was wondering, what was the aggregate value of the Tahoe Donner experience? You showed like a reduction in premiums and deductibles. I'm curious if you just added it up, what was that worth?
Oh, I see. That's a great question. I don't have the answer off the top of my head. I know that the total insured area was just under 1,500 acres. Recreational land up in that area is probably at least, I'd say, $3,000 to $4,000 an acre. So yeah, that would give you a ballpark.
Okay.
The piece that I didn't mention is that the insurance product we ended up developing is called a parametric insurance product, and that's different than a indemnity product, which is like your typical homeowner insurance or your car insurance. Parametric insurance product is triggered by an event and pays out immediately once that event is detected. And so we wrote in sort of pragmatic, easy to implement set of rules around if there's a wildfire and it's detectable by XYZ satellite imagery, then the policy pays out, and that's it. So pretty straightforward. And it paid out differentially depending on the value of the recreational land. That was the two colors, the two hues of purple. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Bryn.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for all this great information. I'm curious about the phase 2 of that work, expanding from the open space into individual homeowners. What is that process going to look like?
Yeah, no, so are we. I think so. Our plan at this point is, first and foremost, we have to garner some additional resources, because the project I described was 2 years of work and a lot of staff time to get that over the finish line. And unfortunately, the person who was leading it from TNC took another job. So we're currently sort of in between on capacity, which I'm sure all of you can appreciate. But that said, I'm sure we can find the funding. And when we do, we'd go back to that 100 or so folks that we talked to the first time, with this win in our pocket, as evidence that a global insurance company and underwriter who are willing to go down this road, and see who, if anyone, wants to go down to the next step and actually insure some of the structures. And so that is definitely on our radar. That's part of the plan, and it's really one thing that Dave Jones, the former insurance commissioner, has impressed upon us at TNC, which I think is just a valuable lesson, is that when you're working with the private sector, it's not as friendly and, you know, warm as in our comfortable conservation community. It's all about how many policies can they sell and to whom. It's really about, you know, the business, right? And so we can have the best available science and risk reduction models in the world, but ultimately you have to have a company that's willing to underwrite the risk, and you have to have a buyer. And those are the two things. So I think the next step is being systematic about how we target potential buyers and communities. And maybe we find communities that already have like really great advocates within the community that are aware of and want to act on behalf to fortify and save and create safety for their community.
Dan, I have a question, perhaps might be our last one, so we can wrap up. You talked earlier about the pillars of resilience, and I want to tie that to what you just shared. You know, you were talking to insurance companies and homeowners associate. I mean, really very different people with different frames of reference, and who look at a forest or even a tree through a very different lens than through a conservation lens. And I'm curious how the pillars of resilience, how you use that to have conversations to bridge frames of reference, or, you know, industries. You know, you may be there for biodiversity and there for some other part of the resilience wheel. Kind of how did that?
Yeah,
how did that go?
Yeah, it was in the context of the North Yuba partnership, which is where we went deepest, in that, you know, as an example, there was the Nature Conservancy as one seat at the table, and then there was the Sierra County supervisor, Paul Rowan, who's a really nice guy. Sierra County is like the least populated county in California, extremely cash poor and all about cattle and timber harvesting. So pretty opposite ends of the spectrum. So we're sitting across the table with Paul Rowan, and like, how do you get to yes? It's kind of what you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
And we did it by, you know, establishing those standard things that I'm sure you all have used at the outset. Like, these are the standards of behavior for our collaborative. This, you know, be respectful, stick to the what, not the who. And we knew that not everyone around the table was going to get everything that they wanted at the end of the day in terms of the optimization scores. And so we acknowledged that. And then it was just really a methodical and, you know, month after month process of give and take until we got to the place where we felt like we could put something forward that we would all be proud of. So so that's, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but not rocket science, but it's just partnership.
Maybe that should have been the title of this meeting, is it's not rocket science, it's partnership.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that seems but it also is kind of rocket science, because it's hard. It's really complicated, and if it were easy, it would be happening all over the place, all over the world easily. Unfortunately, it's not. Thank you, Dan. If everyone, please join me in thanking Dan for speaking today, for sharing his stories, for sharing the graphics, the data. that you've developed along with your colleagues. Thank you for taking us to the Sierras, if only virtually for a little while. It's fun to look at that map of the Sierras and think about how fun it would be to be up by those rivers and in those lakes. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, it's not a bad place to work, that's for sure.
It could be worse.
It could be worse. Yeah, no, but thank you so much for inviting me. It's such an amazing group. I hope to stay in contact with it a bit more. We've been very nose down for a while, and we have more of a outwardly facing campaign that I can just name, so you guys can look it up and see if you want to have your organization join. We're basically, in June, we launched this coalition called the Wildfire Solutions Coalition. Mm-hmm. And it's dedicated to sort of external education and advocacy around adequate and sustained funding for wildfire resilience at the state level, federal level, and local level. So I'll drop the website in the chat, and if you have any questions about it, feel free to give me a call.
Great. Really appreciate you, Dan. Thank you for being here.